Happy Friday, Augustonians. Congratulations on finishing up the week. We want to wish you a joyous Women's History Month. Tonight, we are speaking with the illustrious Dr. Yaba Blay. And on March 26th, I will be in conversation with photographer and visual artist Nona Faustine in partnership with the Andy Warhol Museum. Nona's work is a part of their current exhibition, Fantasy America, that is now open. Our episode tonight is very timely. While the conversation within the Black global community about colorism and Blackness has always been constant, recent public events have made the conversation and question around who is Black and how we as a community address colorism a hotter topic than usual. We are honored tonight to speak with Dr. Yaba Blay, whose recently released New York Times bestseller, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race with Photography and Direction by Noelle Teilhard, provides guidance, historical, and cultural context to help deepen the debate and open up a compassionate and generous space for learning and reflection. Dr. Yaba Blay is a scholar activist, public speaker, and cultural consultant whose scholarship, work, and practice centers on the lived experiences of Black women and girls with a particular focus on identity, body politics, and beauty practices. Lauded by O Magazine for her social media activism, she has launched several viral campaigns, including Lots of Love, #PrettyPeriod, and #ProfessionalBlackGirl, her multi-platform digital community. In 2012, Dr. Blay served as a producer on CNN's television documentary, Who is Black in America, and has since been named one of today's leading Black voices by the Root 100 and Essence Magazine's Woke 100. She has appeared on CNN, BET, MSNBC, BBC, and NPR, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, Ebony, Essence, Fast Company, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Color Lines, and The Root, to name a few. Her commentary is featured in A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond, a permanent installation exhibited in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And she is the author of the award-winning, let me reach my book. Here it is, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. Widely respected as one of the foremost thought leaders on Black racial identity, colorism, and beauty politics, Dr. Blay is a globally sought after speaker and consultant with an extensive client list of over 24 academic institutions, including Harvard University, Duke University, Spelman College, New York University, to name a few, and such corporate entities as Netflix, Unilever International, Shea Moisture, Estee Lauder Companies, Procter & Gamble's My Black is Beautiful, and the #MeToo movement. Dr. Yaba Blay earned a Master of Arts and PhD in African American Studies with distinction, and a graduate certificate in Women's Studies from Temple University. She also holds a Master of Education in Counseling Psychology from the University of New Orleans. The former Dan Blue Endowed Chair in Political Science at North Carolina Central University. She has also taught on the faculties of Lehigh University, Lafayette College, and Drexel University, where she served as the director of the Africana Studies Department. Congratulations for joining the New York Times bestseller list, Dr. Blay, and thank you for being with us and joining us.
Thank you for having me. Let me retract that. It's not the New York Times just yet. We're still trying to get there, but it is a bestseller, national bestseller, through bookshop.org.
Okay, well, that's still amazing. And I think that it's also like necessary, right? It should be a national bestseller, because I think this book is going to help a lot of people get a lot of learning in a tone that you've struck very beautifully, right? And so sometimes we have to receive difficult information, but it's always better when it's well toned, especially when it's amazingly written. So thank you. Did you want to share with us from the book?
Sure. So the book is organized in various sections, and before including some of the narratives and perspectives of the 60 folks who are featured in the book, as well as their portraiture, I organize them according to sections that I've called mixed race, American Black, and diaspora Black. So I want to read the introductory section of the mixed Black portion of the book. Okay. So one of the first interviews I conducted was with a woman I went to graduate school with. I remember very clearly that neither I nor any of my female colleagues took a liking to her initially, even though we hadn't yet been formally introduced or shared any conversation or interaction. We didn't know anything about her at the time, not even her name. It was just something about her. It was her vibes. She seemed like one of those light skinned girls, like she thought she was too cute, too good to speak. Shortly before she graduated from the program, a professor encouraged me to connect with Danielle because of a paper she had written in his class, one that aligned with my interest in skin color politics. Shortly thereafter, a mutual friend introduced us. Much to my surprise, Danielle was cool and we got along fine. Years later, as I began to identify potential people to interview for this project, Danielle was one of the first people I thought of. Although I did not know how she specifically identified racially, I assumed that because she enrolled in and graduated from the African American Studies Department at Temple, a program historically known for its resolute Afrocentric perspective, she at the very least identified as a person of African descent. What she shared about her background and experiences put everything I once thought I knew about her into perspective. She grew up in the middle of Pennsylvania in a Mennonite community, daughter of a white Mennonite mother and an African American father. In that community, it was painfully clear to her and everyone else that she was Black. So much so that she didn't have a lot of friends and was ostracized in school. Later, when she moved to Philadelphia to attend Temple, not only was her Blackness called into question, but she experienced a new type of ostracism, retaliatory pain inflicted by browner skinned Black women. It wasn't that she thought she was cute or too good to speak, quite the opposite. She would have loved to connect with us, but given her experiences, she in many ways felt socially awkward and felt the need to be cautious when entering social situations. We proved her right, and she proved us right, or so we thought. Like Danielle, a number of contributors are technically biracial, with parents of two different races. Their experiences reveal that the issue of language is an important one. For some, the term biracial obscures their lived experience as well as their identity. In Jay's estimation, the term implies or buys into a concept of someone who's mixed, being half Black, half white in a way that doesn't really correlate with the experience of being a human being. Lena, who is quite adamant about not self identifying as biracial, believes that in the global context, the term is part of the machinery that seeks to divide and conquer oppressed people and marginalize and isolate people of African descent, African and indigenous ancestry. While the term biracial is offensive for many, most contributors seem accepting, if not embracing, of the term mixed. For Josen, saying that he's mixed is just stating a fact, answering the question as it was asked. Culturally, however, he identifies as Black. For him, as for many other contributors, mixed is not mutually exclusive from Black and or African American, and some use the term simultaneously and interchangeably to self-identify. Whereas in the contemporary moment, someone of mixed race parentage would be given the option to select all that apply or check other and fill in the blank. In years past, there were only two options, Black or white. Adopted as an infant in the 1950s and having grown up in the North Carolina of the Klan, CB didn't learn that his father was white until he was 12 years old. And still, for him, that didn't change his lived experiences as a Black man in the South. Born in the late 1960s to an Afro-Cuban mother and a white Australian father, Maria, better known as Soledad O'Brien, was always told that she was both Black and Latina from a very early age. And from her perspective, her parents did her a huge favor in doing so. Perhaps this marks a generational difference, parents issuing their children's identity to them. Perhaps this was a simple necessity given the racially charged times. Many mixed contributors have had to face and address questions of belonging throughout their lives. While Perry recognizes that whites may be more comfortable with him than they might be with someone of a darker complexion, from his experiences, white people are clear. You're not us, you're Black, and treat him as Black. To Gist, has had a different experience in that she finds that she is more comfortable in white spaces. However, in African American spaces, she is often made to feel like an outsider. It is rare that other Blacks see her as a sister. By the time June discovered that he was actually biologically of African descent, he was in his mid 30s and had been self identifying as Black for much of his adult life. For him, identity was connected to a sense of home, and he had always felt at home in Blackness. Self identification for many people of mixed heritage is as much predicated on social realities as historical or genetic ones. And for many of our contributors, their Blackness was never an option. However, as we will witness in more detail in the final section, Diaspora Black, when we examine Blackness in regions outside of the United States, we glean a different relationship between mixedness and Blackness than what an American history reveals. Elsewhere, being mixed of Black ancestry does not automatically signal Blackness. Despite often being mistaken for white in the United States, in Jamaica, Deborah is regarded as brown, a social and class-based category often regarded as distinct from Black. Ariel sees his Blackness as his choice, a conscious political choice, especially given that in his home country, Cuba, he could easily take on any number of identities, none of which would have to be Black. James Bartlett experienced cross national differences in social racial realities firsthand when he traveled to Ghana. Although he had often been mistaken for Puerto Rican or Italian at home in the United States, he had never been mistaken for purely white. In Ghana, where one is either Ghanaian or not, mixedness is more aligned with otherness in general and whiteness more specifically. And thus, most Ghanaians assumed that James was an Obroni, a white man or foreigner. The space between their presumed identity and their self identity is one that a number of contributors have had to consistently navigate. Kathleen, who appeared on The Donahue Show in the 1990s in an episode entitled Blacks Who Pass for White, once imagined herself trapped in the body of a white woman. But through a variety of life experiences, she has now come to appreciate the pale wrapper the creator put her in. May, whose mother is Asian and father is African American, remembers visiting the Whitney Museum as a child and receiving what would become her favorite pin, one that read, "I never imagined wanting to be white," which captured her inner feelings perfectly. Brandon is often asked why he would identify as African American when he could easily pass as something else. In response, he says that he, quote, lives by the words of Frederick Douglass. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. What the narratives featured in this section reveal is that what it means to be mixed race is not at all the same for everyone.
Thank you so much. Again, show the book one more time. Stay on the wait list, keep looking for it. You're gonna get your copy. It's really, really wonderfully written. And the testimonies from the interviews and the contributors are eye-opening and touching. And in some respects, you know, their own stories can kind of hand it to you in your own personal experience of Blackness, which was what happened to me and some of these testimonies or contributions that I encountered, as far as like switching my lens about Blackness and thinking about colorism, light skin privilege. These are all things that everyone in the book talked about. But I want to know about, because we have a very like mixed audience that watches us when it comes to education and class and everything else. And so I know that there's a question of how, right? How do you get to being able to write something like this? How do you decide what to get your degree in? Or how do you decide what to read if you're an independent scholar and you're learning on your own? So what was your path to deciding what you wanted to study? You have a master's degree in counseling psychology. How did you get through, choose your educational path and then come to the project as such?
I mean, that's a whole nother, that's a long presentation in and of itself, but I mean, I think that my work on skin color politics is very much fueled by my experience growing up dark skinned Ghanaian American in color coded New Orleans. So, colorism is my life. Colorism is my life experience. And for me, getting to a space of wanting to, I don't know, study things. I wanted to study things that would make an impact on my own experience, I suppose, wanting to understand colorism. Particularly, I remember, watching School Days. I remember seeing different mediated conversations around colorism, even first hearing that colorism was a thing, right? Opened my eyes to, this is not just my personal experience, or this is not just isolated to New Orleans. So of course I wanted to know more about it. So naturally it was something that, or at least naturally for me, it was something that I wanted to study when I entered graduate school. But my first master's is in counseling. And I'm not really sure the succinct way to talk about how I came to that. But, from undergrad, studying psychology was very much process of elimination. I didn't want to do math. I didn't want to do science. I wasn't really interested in much. I mean, I think quite honestly, for many folks, I know myself, my father is a professor. My mother had a college degree. Going to college was never presented as an option to me. And I see that still in a lot of ways, that we require children, students, to go to college, right? And we act as if the pathway to college is a natural one, or that all of a sudden when you're 15, 16, 17 in high school, that you should know what you want to study or what you want to be, for the rest of your life. I didn't know. I was 16. I was having a good time, I wasn't required to think seriously about life. And so, now I have to go to college. Let me eeny, meeny, miny, moe my way through this application. And I picked psychology because it sounded interesting, you know? Um, and that's how I came to study psychology. I graduated without a job. And in that interim between not having a job and having a job, thought about more things. My first job was as a social worker for Big Brothers Big Sisters. And the part of my job that I appreciated the most was, helping folks and talking to families and trying to figure out the source of their issues and perhaps even finding resources to address those issues. So counseling psychology made good sense. And I wanted to go back home. I was in Delaware at the time, and I was trying and had been trying desperately since high school to get back to New Orleans. And so I did a master's degree at the University of New Orleans, and counseling psychology, was an option. So I say that just in all honesty to say, like, it's not like I sat somewhere and mapped out this trajectory for my life, as much as like I was just trying to make sense of and make do with the options that were presented to me. It wasn't until later when I went to graduate school for my second master's and PhD that it started feeling like I was making some things fit for myself, And so in AFAM and Black Studies, I chose to study skin color politics. I wrote my dissertation on skin bleaching in Ghana. And so it's very much been fueled by personal experience and my own personal interests.
So the way that you've constructed the book project is that you interviewed up more than 100 people and you had the same set of questions for each person.
For the most part.
And so I'm wondering if your experience in counseling and psychology helped you form those questions towards people. Did you think about your counseling and psychology experience or your experience as a social worker when you were coming up with the questions that you were going to ask different contributors? And also, how this is like a huge topic, right? A lot of people even have trouble discussing this within their own families. And so to write a book about it, to share with the world, seems like another level of getting involved in the discussion and the conversation. How do you say yes to a project like this that you know is going to impact you personally and also impact your broader community?
I mean, these aren't things that I necessarily have to sit down and think about and struggle with. I think my background in counseling psychology and therapy aligns well with conducting qualitative research. You know, qualitative research is all about gathering qualitative data. So talking to folks, whether it be through, you know, gathering surveys or doing interviews. And I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy getting in people's business. And so it just makes sense. And so it's not anything I have to consciously think about in terms of like my counseling background. But when you are constructing qualitative research and you're thinking of the questions, you do have to think about the entire process, because particularly in a project like this, what I'm aware of is that this is me entering a space that I don't necessarily have to have access to in regards to accessing the truth, right? So if I start with my own personal experience growing up dark skinned in New Orleans, wanting to get insight from folks who self-identify as Creole, a social group that in many ways rejects and keeps the gates closed to folks who look like me, right? So then to enter that space and ask them not only to tell me about their identity, but to tell me about the ways in which you reject people who look like me, like that is a big challenge, because everyone does it, none of us, right, always feel comfortable telling the truth, especially based upon who's asking the question, particularly if you think you might hurt the person's feelings or offend them. And so there is some strategy involved in terms of how do I set the stage to make someone feel comfortable enough to tell me their truth. And a lot of that has to do with them trusting what you'll do with their words, right? That you won't weaponize the truth that they tell you against them. And so in this moment, I can't necessarily remember exactly how I did it, but I know that when I think of the process of even creating the book, I conducted the interviews, I recorded them, I transcribed them. From the transcription, I created a narrative, and then I sent those narratives to each contributor, and we did edits together that I promised that I would not publish anything that they did not approve. There were folks who pulled out of the project because they weren't ready to have those truths put in print, right? And attached to their names. And that's fine, you know, because again, it's my word, my name's on the cover of the book, but when you open the book, it's their picture, it's their lives, and they're still being, you know, recognized in the world, you know, having their pictures, um, you know, projected onto screens. Some were a part of the CNN documentary. Like, people aren't checking me about this, but this is them, you know? So I had to, I wanted them to trust me, you know, with their truths. Um, and then to also know that I would defend them as best I could, because again, they didn't have to tell us this truth. None of us are required to tell the truth.
We received a question before we signed on from Stephanie Meyer. And one of her questions about doing this kind of work was, you know, working with dismantling white supremacy is a lifelong project. It's incredibly taxing on communities and as well as individuals who are doing that work. And one of her questions was, how do you keep from screaming? How do you possibly strategize around something that's so personal? You end the book with a very poignantly written outro about what you've learned via yourself as a product of conducting the project. But also, how did you deal? I imagine that as you were going through the interview process, as you said, you had to compassionately receive responses that may not have been, you know, easy to deal with. And so what has it been like? The book was first released in 2013 and was re-released recently this year. So what has it been like to have this re-release, this renewal, and kind of confront the world, white and Black audiences alike? And what's your personal methodology for strategizing around something so personal?
I mean, race work is not for the faint of heart, right? And so for folks, and I think that's something that we have to reckon with for folks who, and not just race, but in a lot of things, I think sometimes it's easy to sit behind screens or look at our phone screens and see someone doing something and perhaps, you know, whether it's making money or gaining visibility and somehow thinking, oh, I want to do that, I'm gonna do that too. Everything isn't for everybody, right? And I say that to say, you know, to the question, how do you keep from screaming? why would I keep from screaming?
Mm-hmm.
It comes with it. You know what I'm saying? I have a PhD in Black Studies. There's a long history of things that I had to learn and contend with, and knowing good and well I didn't learn them all. You can't keep from screaming. That would make me not human. I have to respond to these things in a particular way. And you mentioned that the book was released in 2013. What's critical to understand is that I did this myself the first time. This is a self-published book in 2013. I did all of this work myself, along with Noel, along with other folks that I pulled into the fold, but I did this myself. The first time around was the absolute hardest. I worked myself into sickness because I had something to prove to the publishing industry. This book was rejected by the publishing industry the first time around because they didn't consider this a necessary conversation at the time, and certainly not one that they wanted to invest resources in, because comparatively, this is an expensive book because it's full color photography and hardcover, right? Well, what's interesting and what it's taken time and heartache to learn and understand on this side of things is that for those of us who are creatives, whether it's, writing words or creating content, there are always gatekeepers who we have to go through for our work to be put out there in a particular way. And I think we give those people so much power when really the lens through which they're looking, the lens through which they're making decisions is based upon money, not based upon the value of the work, based upon their ability to make money from it. So whereas being rejected the first time around absolutely made me question the value of my own work, right? But now looking back, it's like, who are those people? And no shade, but just to say, like, they were doing a job. This wasn't about, this is a project that we need to embrace, or work that we need to address in 2013. This was about, can we make this money in 2013, right? And again, still no shade. I'm very thankful that Beacon picked it up in 2020. It's now been re-released in 2021. But also, let's not forget that 2020 is the year that everyone decided they wanted to be woke. It's the year that everyone decided it's time to take on an anti-racist lens. So of course this book, of course it's time, because everybody wants to talk about race now, right? So for those of you who are interested in doing race work, now's your time. You see what I'm saying? But for those of us who we live in this world, we recognize the insidious nature of white supremacy. There will never not be a time to talk about race. Right now is the time to make money off of race. That's the difference, right? So all of that to say, like, I don't even know what I said all that to say, but to answer the question, it's just more so that, like, yeah, this isn't, I understand perhaps the source of the question. I would love to be able to give feedback and guidance and say, do this, don't do that. But the reality is, like, none of this work is easy. And when you do work about race, when you do work about Black people, particularly from um, a perspective where you want to lift Black folks up and you want to check white supremacy for what it is, it's never going to be easy. It's not going to be received necessarily with open arms. And I'm not just talking about from white folks, because nobody wants to have to change what it is they understand reality to be. They don't want to come out of their comfort zone. And so to put oneself out there as someone who does this work is to put myself on the front line. Doing this work costs. And I'm not talking about money, but it comes with it. And so I have to keep that in mind. Um, but yeah, I don't know that there's a way to avoid what comes with it.
Thank you.
It's definitely shifted, I would say. Um, since 2013 and since the first time around, there were times where I felt literally paralyzed by the feedback that I was getting from folks. Now it's like, all right, I'm good. I think if you go through it long enough and receive enough hits, you get hardened to it in a particular way. But it was definitely hard the first time around.
And so one of the contributions in the book came from Perry Vision DiVirgilio. And he was very, very staunch, and he was giving his experience, talking about his father being white, his mother being Black, and people having questioned his Blackness or his identity. And one of the things he said is that when he says he's Black to others, they say, no, you're not Black, you're biracial. And then he responds and he says, cool, so make sure you don't claim Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington during Black History Month, giving a nod to the fact that both of their fathers were white. And so the debate continues despite us having more access to historical context and factoids such as this, understanding, you know, the parentage or the family history of W.B. Du Bois, or some Harlem Renaissance writers, or thinking about our famous people like Tiger Woods or Barack Obama. The debate continues, and it still continues. And I think that maybe there's a way that we may be overestimating maybe a communal access to like historic, like history period, or maybe we're underestimating the real pain that colorism causes, or maybe it's a combination of both, perhaps. That's a signal as to why the debate continues within our communities. But I wanted to know your perspective on the continuation of the debate, because I know in the Twitter sphere, when the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry Oprah special happened, Twitter exploded with people giving very personal, very, very intimate accounts over social media about their experiences with colorism. So why do we continue the debate despite all of the access to the historic record?
Just because you have access to it doesn't mean that you access it. And most of us don't learn anything until we're required to. And so if you're only required, like even when I think about this COVID moment and children being still required to go to school because it's the law, what are they required to learn? They're not required to learn about race. And so these conversations happen because the large majority, particularly of American folks, have no grounding in any kind of racial history. We learn the history that they tell us is important to know, which is why you learn about so-called heroes, so-called, you know, important dates. It's the dates that, because American history is written so as to make you what's the word? A patriot. So you're going to learn about certain occurrences from the perspective that makes Americans either look like the victors or the victims when it's convenient, right? And so I say that to say these conversations are happening because the large majority of us aren't grounded in any understanding of race itself. We treat race as if it is a fact and not something that people talk about race being a social construct. Race is a political construct. Race was created to support racism. Whiteness is what they said whiteness is. Blackness is what they say blackness is, because they needed to set up these boxes and these categories, right? So that whiteness could control blackness. So fine. Historically, when there were only two categories, white or black, be it colored, Negro, Afro-American, African-American, whatever the language was that they used, there were two categories. These categories didn't account for all of the mixedness in between. One drop rule says you're black. We don't have time for all these other, you know, terms and ideations at the time. You're black. And for Black folks, that was something that we didn't question because we didn't have the option to. It wasn't a choice because, again, race was given to us. So if the white people say you're either white or you Black, and we know we're not white, then come on, everybody, which is why our families can look like the entire color spectrum and nobody's asking questions. You might point out the difference, insert colorism, but we're not questioning their race because we only have one understanding of race, yes? Then here comes a moment in time where, without a grounding in that particular history, we believe that we have the power to change that history simply by creating more categories. Simply by saying, I'm not white, I'm not Black, I'm biracial. I'm not white, I'm not Black, I'm mixed. That's all fine and good, but what does that do in relationship to that history? What does that do now in the context of our lived experiences? Are you treated differently because you're mixed? Or because you're bi? And you may be, right? But mixed and biracial then also becomes a huge category because mixed with what? Mix between what and what. That's not limited to black and white. That's why when Tiger Woods comes out with Cablinasian, we all looking at him like he crazy. Because how many other Cablinasians are there? We want to believe, and I think that's probably part of American delusion behind choice. We want to believe that we have the power to create these choices for ourselves. And if it makes you feel good on the paper to check other and write whatever you want on the paper, fine, feel good in that moment. But you should know that they will take that paper in the back room, look at what you wrote in the other, and figure out based on their instructions what box to put that back in. So you felt good in the moment, but how does it count? What does it mean in the context of the thing that they're attempting to understand? And so, when Vision is talking about that, it's like, all right, cool, you're right. And I think about that even now, right? When in this moment, and I'm not a big Twitter person, because Twitter be wilding, but when I see the conversations that happen, particularly around the gatekeeping in the age of the Rachel Dolezals and stuff, which I understand the need for, right? To some degree. But at the same time, in this moment, I have this kind of struggle speaking with folks of younger generations, right? When they're like, she's not black. All right, well, then what is she? Oh, I don't know. She's just not black. Like, we want to look at her and be like, she's not one of us. But then when asked, what is she? That's not your concern. You just know she's not one of us. Cool. So let's use that same lens then and go back all the way through history. Wouldn't have no Black History Month. All of the people that we put on stamps and all the people that we call our national heroes, wouldn't be none of that. W.E.B. Du Bois himself, his list of the talented 10th, most of those people were multiracial. If we want to use that language, biracial, mixed race, they were Black at the time. Right? And so it's frustrating because, again, I understand the need to want to get clear because we don't want to live our lives in a way that still gives white folks, white supremacy, white ideology, the power to name us, right? We want to take that power back. And that's fine. And I support that. But we have to be very strategic and critical about what it is we're replacing it with. We want to throw away the one drop rule, bet. How are we now going to define Blackness? Who's going to be Black and why? Or who's going to be Black and how? And who is in the position to define Blackness? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be you? Who gets to determine? Who do we trust? What benefit is it going to serve? What function is that Blackness going to serve? So on the one hand, it's like we are operating perhaps in our feelings, right? I get it. The case of Rachel Dolezal pissed everybody off. I get it. I get it. But still, I want us to also move beyond that kind of knee-jerk reaction to get to a place and a space where our definitions and understandings of Blackness serve a function. For me, Blackness is a global identity. It's a political identity. It is one that is interchangeable with so many, right? So whereas my family is Ghanaian, I might be able to identify as American-born Ghanaian, Ghanaian American, first generation, any number of terms. I identify as Black. If you want to have some specific understanding of my Blackness, then yes, I'm Ghanaian American, but I'm going to lead with Black, capital B, because from a political perspective, there are more. I don't want to be Tiger. I don't want to be Cablinasian and be the only one. I want to connect with as many people on this planet as I can, because otherwise you sit in this space and you believe the ultimate Jedi mind trick. We're minorities. We might be a minority in this country, 13% of the population. And if you don't leave this country, right, you might believe that. If your only access to the world is based upon what you see on the TV, you might believe that. But when you get up out of your comfort zone and move out into the world, you recognize that we are actually 2/3 of the world, if not more. I need the I need the name. I need the identity. I need the box that's going to make sure that me and all my people are categorized together
Mhm.
because that serves a political function. And by politics, I mean negotiations of power. It's not how about how I feel, because race has always been about power.
Right. So we have a question from Dr. Larry Glasgow, who is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he asks, is the US the only country with a one-drop rule? If so, why? If not, what other countries also have the one-drop rule?
I'm not sure that other countries have. So the one drop rule is one that it's a social understanding that became legality. And it became legality during the period of enslavement, of course, when the question was what to do with these children who are coming as a result of the, long-term rape of enslaved African women.
Mhm.
Um, and it was a way to try and attempt to protect whiteness, right? They defined whiteness as pure at a time where this is why children take their father's last names, at a time where they were trying to decide what to do with these children. Are these children white? Are they yours? Do they get more privilege? In creating this rule of hypo descent that says ultimately whiteness is pure, any one drop of anything else makes you something else, it was supposed to discourage the mixing of the races, but in reality, it actually encouraged it because now these white colonists didn't have to take care of these children as their children, right? These children took their mother's names. These
Mhm.
children belonged to their mothers, and now these colonists had another source of labor, another piece of property, right? So we know that this rule, at least in the American context, was on the books until 1967 with the Loving versus the State of Virginia case.
Mhm.
Didn't get off the books in the last anti-miscegenation law to be overturned was in the year 2000 in the state of Alabama, right? So that recent. In other countries, I can't speak to, I don't want to misspeak, I can't speak to whether or not they were actual legalities, but understanding that in other spaces, it wasn't one drop, right? In a lot of other places, one drop of something else is enough to make you something else, right? And so you will see all these other particularly like in places like Brazil, particularly in Latin America, you
Mhm.
see all these different categories based upon um, uh, I was going to say quantifications, but like, one fourth this, three fourths that, like all these different categories, different names, mulatto, grife, so on and so forth. Um, Based upon your background, we see it in Brazil, we see it in Cuba. Um, so we see that kind of stratification in a lot of other spaces. One of the contributors talked about also like in Jamaica and other places in the Caribbean, that mixedness, we come up with different terms of terminology, Browning, Cooley, like all of these other terms that also speak to a level of mixedness, but ultimately it's not like the United States example, right? So in the United States, whatever the mixedness was, we don't care, you're Black. Where in all these other places, it's like, well, how much of this and how much of that, it'll give you this. It's just all of these different categories based upon your unique amalgamation, dare I say. Um, so the one drop rule is characteristically American.
And I also want to talk about your writing style because I love it. And you're able to compress so much history and information very clearly into a book that's photography, maybe 4 or 5 essays, and then contributions, testimonials from the people that you've interviewed. What is your editorial process like? How did you choose the histories and which information to include? How did you strategize around the book? And where does your writing style come from?
I think I started with the interviews and the transcriptions and piecing together their narratives. And in so doing, wanting to see what context would I have to provide to make all of to shine light on their stories, to give enough context for their stories. I knew that I had to do, and this is a very brief history, right? There's so much more. And so I didn't want the book to be about me as much. I wanted the stories and the portraits to lead. So how much can I say, as an introduction that will be just enough? So it was that process, definitely starting with the interviews, portraiture happening at the same time. I feel like I wrote around everything else at the end, you know, um, the introduction and the leads to each of the section I wrote after I finished writing their stories for the most part. And then in terms of my writing style, I mean, I want to write in a way that's accessible to folks. It's one of my struggles, having been trained as an academic, um, because I know in a lot of academic spaces, you know, we are writing to each other, and we're writing in voices that only we understand, or we're writing in voices that make us sound smarter than we are sometimes. And for me, as someone who's trained in Black studies and women's and gender studies, I don't do this work just to bring attention to, you know, marginalized groups necessarily. I do it, but I want to bring attention to ourselves, if that makes sense. So if I can't write in a way that's accessible to folks, then what's the point for me? You know, I don't see my work restricted to conferences and academic journals and classrooms necessarily, which are all privileged spaces. I want work that is accessible to folks. This book, I think, there's so many folks who have reached out to thank me for this work because it reflects their lived experience, or it could be, you know, the white mother of a mixed race child who's like, my child is 3, can't read yet, but she can flip through these pictures. Or, you know, folks who are coming from different spaces in the world and saying, I've always seen myself as Black, but other people wouldn't allow me to identify as Black. It's so affirming to see that other people are clear about who they are. Like, that's a measure of success for me, that folks for whom this work has applicability, that they're able to pick it up and read it and not struggle to understand what I'm saying. So, you know, it's a challenge because as you do it and as you are working with editors and other folks and getting feedback, there are folks who will make you feel like, you know, perhaps your voice is too simple, or try to have you use words that, I don't know, are a little richer. I'm not sure. Um, but I'm okay with it.
And many of the testimonials provided by your women contributors specifically address politics of desire and colorism. And Kathleen Cross's testimonial, she speaks of going to a club and having like an altercation with one woman who's more melanated than her, but she actually took the opportunity to sit down and talk to her and be like, what's going on? What's up? Like, can we have this conversation? Like, what can we do together? And then we have another contributor, Mariana Ross, who I'm just going to read the quote. And she's talking about her experience with being approached on the street. And she says, they, in reference to Black men, want the body of the Venus, of the Hottentot Venus, with the head and specific features of various Puerto Rican, Asian, and white women. And that also made me think about the kind of media firestorm that popped up when with Beyonce's lyric information, I stunt, yellow bone it. And we had a lot of people, one writer in particular out of New Orleans, that was like, that's really triggering. And that's really traumatic to have that lyric in that, in that song that's so, I mean, it's Beyonce, but so it's like prolific, it's everywhere all the time. And so thinking about Black women, it's like, what would need to happen to address gendered and racialized trauma amongst ourselves if it keeps recurring? Have you imagined or even thought about like what a starting point would be, or is the book your starting point?
No, I mean, I think the thing about it is, I think the way I respond to that question and similar questions is that I don't want to not give us credit for we've been having these conversations. This isn't new. This is a new light being shed on it. It's being approached in new avenues and new audiences. And now because of the media industry, from Beyonce to now, and again, you know, I'm officially an auntie status. So I know that there are younger, women MCs. I think there's one light skin Keisha, there's mulatto, there's all of these names, like you're leading with this. I know that there's been lots of controversy more recently about song lyrics. So these are conversations that are happening in that regard, but we've always, I mean, take it back to school days. We've always been having these conversations, right? They just they change over time, you know, based upon what's happening in the time. The starting point for us is there's no one starting point. We just have to continue to talk about it and to confront it. But I've had many conversations with many sisters through across color lines, and in the same ways that in our work, our so-called anti-racist work, we require white folks to recognize their privilege and be willing to give something up.
Mhm.
The same can be said in the context of colorism. There are a lot of folks who are still in denial about light skin privilege,
Mhm.
right? And so, you know, what are you willing to give up? You know, and to Mariana's point, how do we retrain? I know a lot of sisters who are light skinned who absolutely get offended when men approach them because they're like, you don't like me, you don't know anything about me, you're fetishizing me, you're looking at my body, you're looking at my complexion, you're wondering what it will communicate to the world if you got me and I'm
Mhm.
on your arm. That has nothing to do with me, the individual, right? I remember a sister telling me here in Philly, she's like, I'm walking up the block. It's a dude a block and a half back blowing the horn, you know, trying to holler out the window. What can you possibly see about my face? A block
Mhm.
and a half away. All you can see is my complexion. And that's what's got you blowing the horn, Brian? Right? And so there are a lot of women who take offense to that and don't want any parts of that. There are a lot of women who revel in it.
True. For sure. For sure. We have another comment from Dr. Glasgow. He says, I was once in Ghana and met many people. They seemed to use culture to define identity. They did not accept the idea of Black Americans as an identity. They insisted I was simply white or American, whatever my biological racial mixture. I asked, what is an African? And they said, someone who speaks an African language. And that still puzzles me.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is, for better or for worse, I think it may have to do with a lot of our romanticization of Africa and Africans historically and otherwise that we prioritize their perspective on things sometimes. So when they say something, it's like, okay, help me understand that. Let me change how I think because they said it. But let's not forget that they were also colonized and very much impacted by Western thought. And in many ways, and this is my own struggle being first generation Ghanaian, my parents moved to this country in the late 1960s and they both grew up during, you know, the independence movement of Ghana. But it is to say that there's so many ways that they think about things that are still impacted by colonial understandings, and much of what they were taught about the rest of the world, particularly about Black Americans, like understand that that's by design.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that in America, we are not taught about our connections to other people in other places, vice versa, you know? And so I say that to say that me, Yaba, Ghanaian mother, Ghanaian father, first person to be born in the United States, I have people in Ghana who tell me I'm American. I have people in Ghana who tell me I am not Ghanaian, right? And again, from their understanding, it's more, it is a cultural understanding. So, like, you know, what language do you speak? What food do you eat? You know, how do you talk? All these things about more cultural behavior, and they don't take in, it's like they don't have a way to think about it outside of that, you know? So the fact that yes, my mother and father, my blood might be Ghanaian, but what is more important to them is how I move through the world. Or for them in their ideation, you know, what my consciousness perhaps is about the world. And so they presume that that is an American one, and that it's not possible at all for me to, you know, think or believe like a Ghanaian. And at the same time, not being critical about what that would even mean, given the heavy influence of the British in that space.
And I think that may be also another part of history that's missing, right? If we think about the conservative estimate of people that were taken from the shores of West Africa, if we're only considering West Africa, the
Right.
conservative estimate is 6 million, right? And so in some readings that I've done, it's like there are like entire specific linguistic groups that went different depending on where they were during the internecine wars that fueled into the slave trade. We don't often get taught about the impact of the slave trade on communities and how it assisted colonialism in West Africa. That's something that's a blind spot for both sides, right? For the coast of West Africa and the different nations there, as well as Black Americans, and also like Afro-Latinos or people who are in Latin America who are Black in the Caribbean. We don't have a clear view of what the impact was there. And then there's also not necessarily an impact taught there on what happened to us as well as there. I think one of my most like taught teaching moments was one of my friends, Zubaye, who's from Ghana, once asked me, she went, "What happened to you when you guys disappeared?"
Oh, wow.
And I was an undergrad and I was like, I couldn't say anything. Just remembering that makes me want to cry, and having that dialogue open up, right? Like, what happened to you when we left? What happened, you know? And I think that's also like a historic question that's like super important for all of us. But that leads me kind of to my next question about race as a social construct. We now know or can find the information that it is not biological. We know it's a colonial construct, a social construct meant to place people of African ancestry at the bottom of society wherever colonialism has touched, or people who were considered Black in their respective places. We understand that Blackness is important, and it's a culture, it's a sociality, it's culture, it's music, it's a lot of different things. But is race reformable? Is there a way we can reform race if it inherently reproduces white supremacy or different supremacies? Are we able as Black people to reinvent Blackness without using the lens of race? Are we there yet? Is that a possibility to maintain our Blackness, but understand that we can culturally do this while politically understanding that we have to do something else?
You know, the challenge with a lot of these conversations that I think that we talk about Blackness and us and we and our community as if we have regular meetings, as if we pay dues, you know, as if there is an annual gathering where we're going to have these conversations, right? So I don't know what we can do, because how are we determining who we is and who gets to speak for we? You see what I'm saying? And so like the other part of it is too, is that I think that I don't want to say we give ourselves more power than we have. That's not what I want to say. But what I do want to say is we can't have these conversations without also addressing. We can't do this without pushing back at white supremacy, without addressing white supremacy. Like, we can do whatever we want and still the machine is going to operate the way that it does. The bigger question is, can these two things not be distinct, right? Like, can the work that we do or attempt to do around our identity, around racial categorizations, be part of the work of dismantling white supremacy? But again, it feels so much in theory, and we continue to talk this way. What are we gonna do? What you mean? What's that look like? Operationalize that. Is there a meeting somewhere? Who's in charge? Are we voting somebody as president? You know what I mean? Who gets to speak on our behalf? Because again, we don't all share the same political outlooks on these things, right? And so, yes, for example, there are lots of Black folks on the news anchors. There are lots of Black folks who are our public intellectuals, you know, the folks who get called to give a comment on X, Y, and Z time and time again. Did we vote for Did we say we want you to speak on our behalf? Because the other thing is we can't take capitalism out of this equation. I can say this in honesty. The large majority of people to buy books about race are not Black. The large majority of folks who support my work and their curiosity about this conversation are not Black. These are the folks who will pay for the book that the publishing industry said is expensive. So if we're using book sales, for example, if we're using the New York Times bestseller list, for example, to indicate who should be speaking on behalf of Black folks, know that Black folks may not have voted them there.
Mm-hmm.
See what I'm saying? And so if I'm saying too much,
No.
I'm just saying, like, there's certain work out here that white folks support about race
Mm-hmm.
that don't benefit Black people. It doesn't mean that that person should be the spokesperson about race. It means that white folks are comfortable with that voice. And we don't need white folks to be comfortable in order to ultimately get some change happening. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, that is our time. I could ask you 50 million more questions. You have a message from a Solanda Peak. She says, I cannot wait to read your book. I may get 2 copies, 1 to give away from Solanda.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Dr. Blay. It was such an honor to speak with you and learn from you as well. Thank you for your generosity and being with us. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.